Imagine this. You're sitting in your room reading the Bible, and you come across a passage that says God is in control of everything, every single thing. Your mind starts to race. If God is in control of everything, does that mean He's in control of the bad things too, like the murder of an innocent child or the genocide in Regu? It's a chilling thought, isn't it? For many Christians, especially those who follow a branch of theology called Calvinism, this idea is not just a thought, it's a core belief. Calvinists believe that God has a plan for everything, and nothing happens outside of His will. This means that every evil act, every sin, every tragedy is part of God's grand design. But how can this be? How can a loving God be the one who makes sure these things happen? Let's dive deeper into this shocking idea and see where it leads us. Calvinism, named after the 16th century theologian John Calvin, teaches that God has a plan for everything. This plan is so detailed that it includes every thought, every action, and every event in history. According to Calvinists, God not only knows what will happen, but He also determines it. This means that even the evil things that happen, like the murder of an innocent child, are part of God's plan. But here's the twist. Calvinists also believe that God is not the author of evil. They argue that while God determines everything, He doesn't cause evil directly. Instead, they say that evil comes from the free choices of humans. It's a bit like saying, God set the stage, but the actors chose to play their parts. This view raises some serious questions. If God determines everything, how can He not be responsible for the evil that happens? If He knows that a person will choose to do something evil, and He still allows it to happen, isn't He complicit in that evil? Calvinists have tried to answer these questions in different ways. One common explanation is the idea of secondary causes. They say that while God is the ultimate cause of everything, He uses secondary causes, like the choices of humans, to bring about His plan. For example, they might say that Satan tempted Adam to sin, and Adam chose to sin. So God isn't to blame, but this doesn't really solve the problem. If God is the ultimate cause of everything, and He knows that Adam will choose to sin, then isn't God still the one who made sure that sin happened? It's like a parent who knows their child will steal a cookie and still leaves the cookie jar on the counter. The parent might not be the one who takes the cookie, but they certainly made it possible. This brings us to a bigger question. What does this mean for God's character? If God is the one who determines everything, including evil, how can He be good? How can He be loving and just if He's the one who makes sure that innocent people suffer? Calvinists argue that God's plan is good, even if we can't see it. They say that everything, even the worst evil, contributes to God's greater glory, but this can be hard to accept. How can the murder of an innocent child or the genocide of thousands of people contribute to God's glory? It seems to make God more like a cold, distant ruler than a loving father. To understand this better, let's look at a specific example. The fall of Adam in the Garden of Eden. According to the Bible, God created Adam and Eve and gave them a choice: obey Him or eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve chose to eat from the tree, and as a result, sin entered the world. Calvinists say that God knew Adam and Eve would choose to sin, and He allowed it to happen. But they also say that God didn't cause Adam and Eve to sin. They say that Adam and Eve chose to sin of their own free will. But here's the problem. If God knew that Adam and Eve would choose to sin, and He still created them and put them in a situation where they could sin, isn't He still responsible? It's like a parent who knows their child will get hurt playing with a dangerous toy, but still lets them play with it. The parent might not be the one who causes the injury, but they're still responsible for it happening. Calvinists often use the idea of secondary causes to try to get God off the hook. They say that while God is the ultimate cause of everything, He uses secondary causes, like the choices of humans, to bring about His plan. For example, they might say that Satan tempted Adam to sin, and Adam chose to sin, so God isn't to blame. But this doesn't really solve the problem. If God is the ultimate cause of everything, and He knows that Adam will choose to sin, then isn't God still the one who made sure that sin happened? It's like a parent who knows their child will steal a cookie and still leaves the cookie jar on the counter. The parent might not be the one who takes the cookie, but they certainly made it possible. This brings us back to the bigger question. What does this mean for God's character? If God is the one who determines everything, including evil, how can He be good? How can He be loving and just if He's the one who makes sure that innocent people suffer? Calvinists argue that God's plan is good, even if we can't see it. They say that everything, even the worst evil, contributes to God's greater glory. But this can be hard to accept. How can the murder of an innocent child or the genocide of thousands of people contribute to God's glory? It seems to make God more like a cold, distant ruler than a loving father. This is a tough question, and it's one that many Christians struggle with. If God is in control of everything, how can He be good? How can He be loving and just if He's the one who makes sure that evil happens? As we continue to explore this question, we'll look at different perspectives and try to understand what it means for our faith. We'll also consider whether there are other ways to understand God's sovereignty that don't lead to these troubling conclusions. But for now, let this question linger in your mind. Is it possible that our understanding of God's sovereignty needs to change? Is it possible that there's more to the story than we've been told? The journey to find answers is just beginning. When it comes to understanding God's involvement in sin and evil, especially from a Calvinist perspective, things can get pretty complicated. Let's break it down into simpler terms. First, Calvinists believe that God is in control of everything, every single thing that happens. This is called God's sovereignty. But if God is in control of everything, how can creatures like us have a nature that leads us to sin? And where does that sinful nature come from? Imagine Adam, the first human. According to the Bible, God created Adam and placed him in the Garden of Eden. But something went wrong, and Adam sinned. The big question is, why did Adam sin? And where did the flaw in his nature come from? If God created Adam, and God is in control of everything, then it seems like God must have created Adam with a flaw that made him sin. But this is a problem because it makes God responsible for the sin. Calvinists try to get around this by saying that God knew Adam would sin if placed in certain circumstances, like being near the serpent and the tree of knowledge. But this still doesn't solve the problem because it means God set up the situation for Adam to sin. Now, let's think about how this makes God look. If God knew Adam would sin and still placed him in the garden, it seems like God is manipulating Adam to sin. This is a big issue because it makes God look like a master manipulator. In human terms, it's like setting someone up to fail and then punishing them for it. That doesn't seem fair or loving. Calvinists sometimes use an analogy to explain this. They say it's like a police sting operation, where the police know a criminal will break the law if lured into a certain situation. The police are innocent because they didn't make the criminal a criminal. They just knew the criminal would act a certain way. But this analogy doesn't work well, because the police didn't create the criminal or their nature. God, according to Calvinism, created everything, including Adam's nature. So, God is responsible for the flaw that led Adam to sin. Another problem is that if God is in control of everything and knew Adam would sin, then Adam's sin was inevitable. This means that God made Adam's sin certain, even if Adam sinned voluntarily. It's like saying, I knew you would fail if I put you in this situation, so I put you there. This makes God the author of sin, which is a big theological problem. Calvinists might say that God's intentions are good, even if he allows or causes sin. But this doesn't really solve the problem. If God's intentions are good, why would he set up a situation where sin is certain? Why would a loving God want to render sin certain? Especially if it means some people will suffer in hell forever. When we look at these issues, it becomes clear that Calvinism has some significant challenges. It's hard to see how a good and loving God could be the one who makes sin certain. This is why many people, including non-Calvinist Christians, have different views on God's sovereignty and human free will. For example, Arminians believe that God gives people the ability to choose freely and that God's sovereignty is compatible with human free will. This means that Adam could have chosen not to sin, and God didn't set him up to fail. This view preserves God's goodness and love while still explaining why sin exists. In the end, the debate between Calvinism and other views of God's sovereignty and human free will is about how we understand God's nature and actions. It's a deep and important question that has been discussed for centuries, and it continues to shape how people think about God and their faith. Imagine you're in a big room with a bunch of people talking about God. Some say God controls everything, while others say God lets people make their own choices. This chapter is about the debate between these two views, especially focusing on the idea that God is in charge, but doesn't force people to do things against their will. Let's start with a famous theologian named Ulrich Zwingli. He believed that God is in control, but he also thought that God allows people to make choices. Zwingli said that God's plan is like a big puzzle, and each person's choices are pieces that fit into that puzzle. This means that even though God knows what will happen, he doesn't force people to do specific things. John Calvin, another famous theologian, had a different view. He believed that God has a detailed plan for everything, and nothing happens outside of that plan. Calvin thought that God decides who will be saved and who won't, and that this decision is made before anyone is even born. This idea is called predestination. One of Calvin's followers, Jonathan Edwards, took this idea even further. Edwards believed that everything, even the smallest actions, is part of God's plan. He thought that free will is an illusion, and that people only do what God has already decided they will do. Edwards wrote a lot about this, and his ideas are still influential today. However, not everyone agrees with Calvin and Edwards. A theologian named R.C. Sproul, who is a Calvinist, admits that this view can be hard to understand. He says that if God controls everything, then it can seem like God is responsible for everything, including evil. Sproul tries to explain this by saying that God uses evil for good, but many people find this explanation unsatisfying. On the other hand, some people believe that God is in control, but allows people to make their own choices. This view is called Arminianism, named after Jacob Arminius. Arminians believe that God gives everyone a chance to choose him, and that God's grace can help people make good choices. They think that God doesn't force anyone to be saved, but rather He invites everyone to accept His love. One of the key differences between Calvinism and Arminianism is how they understand the idea of prevenient grace. Prevenient grace is the idea that God gives everyone a little bit of grace to help them choose Him. Calvinists don't believe in prevenient grace because they think God only gives grace to those He has chosen to save. Arminians, on the other hand, believe that God gives grace to everyone, but people can still choose to reject it. A modern theologian named John Piper, who is a Calvinist, has written a lot about God's sovereignty. He believes that God's plan is perfect and that everything, even the bad things, is part of that plan. Piper says that God's glory is the most important thing and that God uses everything to show His greatness. However, this can sometimes make it seem like God is the cause of evil, which is a difficult idea for many people to accept. Another theologian, Jerry Walls, who is not a Calvinist, argues that God's love and goodness are more important than His control. Walls believes that God wants people to choose Him freely, and that this is what makes love real. He says that if God forced people to love Him, it wouldn't be real love. The debate between these two views is still going on today. Some people find comfort in the idea that God has everything under control, while others find it more meaningful to believe that God allows people to make their own choices. Both views try to explain how God can be in charge while still allowing for free will and human responsibility. In the end, the important thing is to think about what you believe and why. Whether you lean more toward Calvinism or Arminianism, the goal is to understand God's love and to live a life that reflects that love. Calvinism is a complex and often controversial system of theology. It's built on the idea that God has predestined everything, including who will be saved and who will not. This chapter delves into the heart of Calvinism, focusing on the concept of election and the idea of double predestination. We'll explore what Calvinists believe, how they justify their beliefs, and the challenges these ideas face. John Calvin, the father of Calvinism, taught that God has chosen some people for salvation and others for damnation. This is known as election. According to Calvin, God's choice is not based on any merit or quality in the person. It is entirely based on God's sovereign will. This means that God has a plan for who will be saved, and this plan is unchangeable and unconditional. Calvinists often point to passages in the Bible, like Romans 9, to support this idea. One of the key figures in Calvinism, Louis Boetner, wrote extensively on this topic. He argued that God's election is based on His own good pleasure and not on any foreseen faith or good works in the person. This means that God's choice is completely sovereign and not influenced by anything the person does. Boetner also emphasized that God's election is not arbitrary. God has His own reasons, even if we don't understand them. However, this idea of election raises some tough questions. If God has already chosen who will be saved, what role does human free will play? Some Calvinists, like R.C. Sproul, argue that while God's election is unconditional, salvation itself is conditional on faith and repentance. This means that God provides the faith and repentance to the elect so they can be saved. But this doesn't really change the fact that God's choice is still the determining factor. Another challenge is the idea of double predestination. This means that God not only chooses who will be saved, but also who will be damned. This is a very difficult concept for many people to accept. it seems to make God responsible for the damnation of the reprobate. Jonathan Edwards, a famous Calvinist, tried to address this by arguing that God's justice in damning the reprobate is just and righteous. He believed that God is not unjust in condemning those who are wicked. But critics of Calvinism, like Bruce, Little argue that this view makes God seem arbitrary and unloving. They point out that Jesus was deeply grieved by sin and sought to alleviate suffering. If God is perfectly revealed in Jesus, then God's character should be seen in Jesus' actions. This means that God's love and justice should be consistent with Jesus' compassion and mercy. John Piper, a prominent Calvinist, has tried to reconcile these issues by emphasizing God's sovereignty and glory. He argues that God's ultimate goal is to display His own glory, and this includes both the salvation of the elect and the damnation of the reprobate. Piper believes that God's glory is more important than human happiness or fairness. However, this view can be seen as making God's actions arbitrary. If God's only reason for choosing some and not others is to display His glory, it seems that God is acting without any real reason that we can understand. This can make God seem unpredictable and untrustworthy. Some Calvinists, like G.C. Berkouwer, have tried to find a middle ground. Berkouwer argued that while God's election is sovereign, it is not arbitrary. He believed that God has His own reasons for His choices, even if we don't understand them. But this doesn't really solve the problem, because it still leaves us with a God who chooses some and not others without any clear reason. On the other hand, non-Calvinists, like John Wesley, have a different view. Wesley believed in prevenient grace, which means that God gives everyone the ability to respond to His call. This means that salvation is not predetermined, but is a response to God's grace. Wesley argued that God's love is universal and that everyone has the opportunity to be saved. The debate between Calvinists and non-Calvinists often comes down to the nature of God's sovereignty and human free will. Calvinists emphasize God's sovereignty, while non-Calvinists emphasize human free will. Both sides have their strengths and weaknesses, and the debate continues to this day. In the end, the question of election and predestination is one of the most challenging and important in Christian theology. It touches on the very nature of God and the human condition. While Calvinism offers a powerful and consistent system, it also raises difficult questions about God's character and justice. Non-Calvinists offer a more hopeful and inclusive view, but they also have to explain how God's sovereignty and human free will can coexist. The debate is far from over, and it continues to shape the way Christians understand God and their place in the world. In this part of the book, we look at how some Calvinists try to protect God's reputation from the criticisms that come with their beliefs. One of the main ideas is that God uses something called middle knowledge to know what people would do in different situations. This way, God can still be in control without directly causing people to sin or do evil things. But even with these ideas, many people still disagree. Some Calvinists say that non-Calvinists don't honor the Bible, while non-Calvinists say the same about Calvinists. It's a bit like two friends arguing about the rules of a game, each thinking they have the right way to play. Roger Olson, the author, believes that even though Calvinists might be very sincere and dedicated to their faith, they can sometimes miss the bigger picture. He thinks that their system, which says God determines everything, can lead to some problems. For example, if God determines everything, it can make it seem like God is responsible for bad things happening in the world. Olson also talks about how some Calvinists try to fix these problems. For example, they might say that God only allows bad things to happen for a good reason, or that God knows what people would do in different situations and uses that knowledge to guide things. But Olson isn't convinced that these solutions really work. In the end, Olson wants us to think about these issues carefully. He believes that it's important to respect different views and to keep talking and learning from each other. After all, the goal is to understand God better and to live a life that honors God and helps others. Roger E. Olson is a professor of theology at Baylor University. He has written many books and articles about theology and is known for his work on evangelical theology. He wants to help people think deeply about their faith and to keep asking questions, even when the answers aren't easy.